morning. Thank you all for joining us today. We're ready to get started here and kick off our panel. We're very excited today to be talking to Facebook academics and advocates about product development and artificial intelligence. We see that most panels over the conference are talking about artificial intelligence in one form or another, and we are certainly all talking about Facebook. So it will be a good opportunity for us to dig deep and talk to the people who are making very important decisions about a product that is being used by now over 2 billion people every day. So we are going to have about a 40-minute discussion here and presentation from our panelists. They're going to spend 20 minutes asking each other questions and having a conversation, and then we'll reserve the final 15 for questions from the audience. With us today, we have Norberto Andrade. He's going to moderate the panel, and he is the Privacy and Public Policy Manager at Facebook. We have Pierre Emmanuel Mazzare. He is with the Facebook AI Research Labs and is a research engineering manager. We have Andrea Renda. He is the Senior Research Fellow and Head of Global Governance, Regulation, Innovation, and the Digital Economy at the Center for European Policy Studies. Next, we have Frederica Kaltweiner, Head of Data Exploitation Program at Privacy International. And finally, at the end there, we have Christoph Lütke. He is Professor and Director of the Institute for Ethics and AI at the Technical University of Munich.
Michelle, thank you so much. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the panel. I'll be moderating this panel, but I'll also be shamelessly abusing my position of moderator and actually delivering also a presentation and an interactive, and we'll get to that later on. So there are three things that we would like to do with this panel. First is to engage the audience into the dynamics of artificial intelligence and machine learning. We have an interactive, and for those that have not had the opportunity to actually build an AI system, this is your lucky day. We'll try to do that as an audience. This is going to be an experiment, so let's see how that goes. Secondly, we also want to showcase the work that we're doing in terms of research in AI. And I have my colleague, Pierre Emmanuel, who will also deliver a presentation telling you the latest that the Facebook Artificial Intelligence Research Lab is doing. And then thirdly, and probably even more important, we want to start a conversation with representatives from the policy community, from civil society, advocacy, but also from academia in advancing the conversation on AI. I would like to focus on a couple of things, namely on company practices, what is happening, what are companies doing, what are they doing well, what could they do better, but also focusing on policy and governance models. And all of that embedded also with the discussion on ethics and what is the role of ethics within all these conversations around governance and policy. So without further ado, I will give the floor to each of our three panelists. They will have a bit of time to maybe introduce themselves a little bit more and tell them about your work and how that ties into the topic of the panel that we're just starting. So probably could start with you, Andrea. Thank you.
That's what I was told. Let me see if this works. It does. Thanks a lot, Michelle, Norberto. Thanks to everybody for being here and address such a controversial issue, which is ethics. And who would have said a few years ago that ethics would have become such a buzzword in the world of policy, and in particular in the world of technology policy? Today, it is really one of the key words. Also because it seems that there is a general understanding that we need to discuss and define ethics and whatever falls under the realm of ethics, to then understand what the law or policy or any other software instruments could potentially do to steer the evolution of AI towards a greater good or towards greater levels of competitiveness. My work in this respect is the work of an academic and the work of a think tanker as well. And my life is divided between academia and think tank, between in particular the College of Europe and the Center for European Policy Studies, which is not far from here. I mean, on this tram line that you see here. And Importantly, I am one of the so-called 52 musketeers, if you want. There are a bit too many, probably, compared to the original story. But the 52 musketeers that are asked to develop the ethical guidelines for AI in the so-called high-level expert group for artificial intelligence set up by the European Commission. Now, it's a very controversial topic for a simple reason. It's that we don't know, first of all, what type of AI that is commercialized is actually legal or illegal. That first threshold, which comes even before we start discussing ethics, is something that deserves a lot of clarification. Which kind of AI goes too far in the direction of, for example, discriminating or tailoring results to specific categories of specific users to make it useful to end users, but when, under what circumstances this is something that breaches fundamental rights, for example, or including, of course, privacy, but I'm sure this will be dealt with later. So I think the first element that one needs to work on is to clarify the basics. What kind of AI has citizenship in the European Union? And this is already complicated in the global debate because Europe keeps, its stance on privacy as a fundamental right, and other countries in the world don't necessarily have the same perspective. In the US, privacy is much more of a property right than a fundamental right, while privacy falls in the sphere of, you would call it inalienability in Europe. It is a much more tradable right in the United States in legal terms. The other thing is also that if you look at the evolution of the policy debate on privacy, in Europe, most of the privacy law evolution has been looking both at government-to-citizen relationship, but also, importantly, at corporation-to-citizen, at supply-to-demand, if you want, relationships in the marketplace. Whereas if you look at the US, for example, most of the evolution of privacy legislation falls under the sphere of the Fourth Amendment. So it's much more about government intrusion into private life, and the equivalents of the GDPR in the US are a much more fragmented and patchy type of legislation. So the key issue in Europe is to find its own secret sauce in this respect, in first of all setting the entry point. What are those rules that have to be complied with necessarily for an AI system to be allowed and legal in the European Union? It is not an easy question. And it's something, because there are a number of these systems that potentially brought before a court might be declared as too discriminatory or too intrusive on the private sphere, and this has not been fully clarified yet. So that is, in my opinion, one of the first things that need to be defined. Second, from the perspective of the high-level expert group on AI, and we are now producing this document here. The draft was published in December, and you have another 24 hours to file your comments, and I think you should, because there's a lot of things to be said, there's a lot to be improved in this document, is to develop a guidance document. And guidance is mostly guidance for those corporations and those AI developers and designers that are conceiving of the next products that will hit the market in the future. And there I think the issue becomes an issue of, also an issue of what we called soft ethics or post-compliance ethics. So beyond the minimum homework that everybody has to do, what else is part of Europe's secret sauce on AI in terms of ethical rules? And there, what has been done so far, it's an illustration and a listing of a number of principles of so-called trustworthy AI, which resonates, if you wish, with many of the other declarations of principles and manifestos that have been published around the world. Be this documents that come from the developer community, for example, the Asilomar principles, or national strategies, or declarations such as the Declaration of Toronto, or Montreal, or what have you. I think this is not enough, meaning that in terms of guidance, the European Commission and the group of experts that support the European Commission should start going into the nuances of, first of all, what is the relevance of those principles? How can companies demonstrate that they've been complying with those principles and values? And also, what would be potentially the enforcement consequences for some of those principles once they are operationalized and translated into policy initiatives and law? There, I think, what is emerging is so far a little bit of a patchwork that we will need to put together in a more orderly way. But what seems to be emerging is a situation in which there is something similar, if I use a metaphor from the agricultural sector, if you wish, to what we call from farm to fork in agriculture. Meaning a situation in which a corporation might want to demonstrate that it has followed good standards of conduct at different stages of the development of an AI system, be that in the design, in the collection of data, in the curation of data, in the training of a machine, in all those activities that revolve around the governance and the control of whether biases, for example, have creeped in the AI system at any stage. Now, is this going to be a super over-regulatory situation in which there is a set of conducts that are mandated for every step? I don't believe this is the case. I think the European Commission has in mind a sort of a monitored self-regulation scheme in which companies signal the way in which they exercise due care in avoiding that their AI systems violate specific values and principles. And those practices are going to have to be validated so far over time. This will be happening through a private certification system or a public certification system, experiments and testing of use cases. I don't think there's going to be any black or white type of solution that emerges on day one and saying this practice is illegal, this practice is something that we would consider desirable, but it's not illegal if you don't comply with it, or that other practice is sort of the top class, haut de gamme, as we call it here, meaning that it qualifies that AI system as in the top tier of the most desirable forms of AI that you might want to use in healthcare, in public policy, or in public procurement. That said, what I see here is a challenge, and as I come to wrapping up my first set of comments. The challenge is understanding what kind of principles will eventually be mandatory and how they will be enforced at EU level. What principles will be considered as principles of responsible AI, and they might have a clear link with liability consequences for companies that don't follow those principles, but the fact that a system doesn't necessarily signal compliance with those principles doesn't make it illegal on day one. And a top tier of principles, which I call sustainable AI principles, which belong to a different sphere. Some of you might have seen in the debate on AI certain things such as AI for good, for example. And there, I think, is one of the challenges for the European Union, on which I think we should have a debate at some point on how to proportionately go in that direction. The European Union potentially has a strategy for 2030. It's called Agenda 2030, that is nested in the Sustainable Development Goals. Is this strategy, which is the medium-term strategy of the European Commission, the North Star for AI policy or not? I give you a first preliminary question. Currently, it is not. Meaning that, even as a high-level expert group, we are working in the direction of maximizing competitiveness for the EU, but not of steering and endorsing and fostering the development of AI for good, for social good. I think this is a key challenge for the EU, because if we ask ourselves the question, how do we increase efficiency on the workplace, for example, we might want to maximize the number of robots on the workplace. If we ask ourselves the question, how can AI help us achieve the goal of full and decent employment by 2030, then we might not want to maximize immediately the number of robots in the workplace. So depending on what North Star and what guiding principles we select, the ethical and the company practices might follow in a hopefully consistent way. Human capital, gender, poverty, inequality, all this fall under the potential sustainable development goals. So I think this is one of the key trade-offs that we're facing today. In terms of practice, I hope that the guidance document that we will produce with the help of companies, and there will be soon an open call for companies to offer their services to test with the Commission the assessment checklist that you find in the draft ethical guidelines. I hope that the Commission manages to develop a relatively clear and predictable regulatory framework and policy framework, even before it is regulatory, for companies to understand what is the perimeter and the space in which they will be able to deploy AI. In all this, there is a risk sometimes of micromanagement and over-regulation. In other cases, there might be a risk of leaving too many gaps. But the overall goal is to establish the EU way of doing AI as the most sustainable and responsible one in the global landscape.
Great, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for this.
Thank you very much for this. I would like to start by commenting a little bit more on the relationship between ethics and the law. because Privacy International is a global organization. We work with partners around the world, some of which are based in countries with very volatile democracies, human rights abuses, and absolutely no protections when it comes to data. So half the world's population is now online, and companies like Facebook are planetary scale companies, and technologies like AI will be applied globally. So in discussions about ethics and AI, the assumption often seems to be that, yes, we have some laws, and the purpose of ethics is then to fill the gaps of the law. And I think this is quite problematic, actually. In the description of the panel, it says, the GDPR offers some protection when it comes to AI, and that's the case. It does apply to personal data, so any AI system that uses personal data as input or output will have to obviously comply by the principles. But I also thought it's very interesting that a lot of companies, and including Facebook's privacy policy, don't really mention the word profiling or automated decision-making. So I think before we quickly move on to ethics, we need to acknowledge that, first of all, in many places around the world, basic laws and protections are lacking. And secondly, that currently we do have a very new law, but its application on AI hasn't really been tested and probed. In November, we filed complaints about a number of data brokers, ad tech companies, and credit scoring referencing agencies, and profiling was one of the key concerns in these complaints. So we're really urgently waiting for cases that will set a precedent on how the law actually applies. I think there's another tendency in these discussions to focus a lot on a very narrow use case, and that is automated decision-making. While we all know that there's a large scope of application, and I personally find profiling quite a fascinating one. I would love to talk a lot more about what does it mean to live in a world where profiling techniques powered by machine learning blur the line between personal data and non-personal data, and sensitive and non-sensitive data. When you can infer and derive and predict a lot of sensitive insights about people from things that are not sensitive at all, in a way that's a game changer, that changes the relationship between governments and people, and between companies and people. So I think any discussion urgently needs to address profiling. Oops. Sorry. And then the other thing I want to mention is, I also think it's important to talk about the role of machine learning in advertisement. What is the role of machine learning in some of the core business practices of the companies that are most prominent when it comes to the research and development of AI?
Thank you. I would like to begin by saying I've just heard again that ethics is such a hype today. And having worked in business ethics for now 20 years, roughly, I must say I've heard this every year since then. Apparently the hype is not over. It's continuing and it's getting bigger, I would say. So I can just briefly say a bit about myself. I have a background in business informatics as well as philosophy. And as I said, I've been working on business ethics a lot, especially for many years on soft law, which is what to some extent what you also mentioned. So soft law practices that are important for companies. There was this famous statement by Milton Friedman in the 70s, I guess many of you have heard it, the social responsibility of business is to maximize its profits. And this is something that probably very few companies would say today. So it has changed. So many of the large and also smaller companies have recognized that they need to do more than just abide by the law and just do business. I would say this is one of the basic lessons of business ethics of the past decades. But I've also worked in the field of ethics of digitization. Broadly speaking, I have been a member of this German ethics committee for autonomous cars, where we, in 2017, came up with a worldwide first code, ethics code for these cars. And I think many of these guidelines that we produced are very relevant to AI as well, such as what are basic criteria for for how a vehicle should behave in cases of unavoidable accidents, and others, privacy issues and many others. Also, it was interesting in this committee to see what is specifically, I would say, German perspective or maybe European, although there are also differences in terms of some ethics issues here. But it was interesting to see what is the perspective there. The ethical perspective is there to some extent a more broadly speaking Kantian perspective, which is maybe not there in other countries. So that was very interesting to deal with it and eventually come to a compromise and find what I regard as a quite good compromise in these guidelines that we came up to. I was also part of the AI for People ethics group, which produced with some of the other group that produced the ethical rules for AI last year, which I found also quite interesting to see how the principal criteria like explainability, which I still think is one of the main things here, tie together. What I would like to introduce for the ethics of AI is we should focus more on the fact that it will be companies, and usually large companies, that will be implementing this kind of technology. And I like to see that here in this conference, this is also taken up. We have a number of, as I saw in the program, we have a number of panels or workshops on the business company perspective, but business ethics perspective also. So if you want to do ethics of AI, if you want to do ethics of digitization, you have to take into account the structures and organization and incentives that work for companies. Otherwise, you won't get very far. And here I would say AI needs ethical rules of a broad and abstract nature, not just detailed regulation that we will also see, and to some extent we are already seeing it, but we also need in these ethical rules to address the fears that are there among population. Even if we can't solve all of them right now, but we need to address them. Otherwise, this technology will not gain the acceptance necessary. And I would like to say, as you said in my introduction, that I'm now fortunate enough to be setting up a new institute for ethics of AI at the Technical University of Munich, where we will be working together with the technical disciplines, the engineering and informatics people, and humanities, social sciences, law, ethics together and work on ethical guidelines for AI. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Many interesting remarks that we'll get back to in our discussion. I think right now what we would like to do is first take you on a journey, and I'll stand up because I think it's better. I'll ask the visual audio friends if they, okay, it's already there. So as you've seen in the agenda, there are many panels on AI, and when we were putting together this panel, we thought about doing something different. It's actually kind of an experiment for the first time here at CPDP, where we would onboard you on an interactive exercise of what it means to build an artificial intelligence system, namely a machine learning system. And we chose specifically a hard topic, which is the use of AI to handle and manage hate speech on our platform. And we wanted to give you a glimpse of what it means to build a system from scratch that will be able to detect that type of content on our platform. But just as a first caveat, this will be illustrative for illustrative purposes. We will not be discussing, at least that's not the idea, to discuss content policies of Facebook. What we want is for you to understand some of the main stages involved in that pipeline process and expose you to both the complexity and the challenges that AI poses in that process. So this is also important to portray AI not as a silver bullet that just solves all the problems. We want to focus actually on the human aspect and the human responsibility that permeates all this design process about designing AI in an ethical and privacy responsible manner. So before that, before getting into the interactive, I will just do a quick one-on-one of artificial intelligence and tell you about machine learning algorithms. What are actually machine learning algorithms? But for that, let's take a step back and understand what are algorithms. So algorithms at the most basic level can refer to any type of decision-making process. They might be digital, but they might even be mechanical. So it's all about a system of rules that are tasked to solve a problem or to achieve a specific outcome. So at the core, that's what an algorithm is. The traditional algorithms follow hard-coded rules that explicitly state every step-by-step process in order to achieve the desired outcome. So they are systems that follow instructions in order to solve that problem or to perform that task. So that's what a regular algorithm is. So what is different about machine learning algorithms is that they are not provided with instructions. They are not programmed. In a certain way, they actually program themselves. So what's interesting about machine learning algorithms is that what we give them are not the instructions, the step-by-step process in order to solve a given task. What we give them is data. And by being exposed to data, machine learning algorithms actually create their own instructions in order then to achieve certain tasks like identifying specific concepts in images or to understand and translate text. So that's, in a very simplistic way, that's what machine algorithms are. So they are a type of artificial intelligence that gives programs and computers the ability to learn without being explicitly programmed. And this will be important for the interactive. So just bear in mind that machine algorithms, they create their own instructions by being exposed to data, and through those instructions, they will be able to act upon new data. They learn from experience, and then they create the rules that will be able to, with new data they have never seen before, to act on that data, to solve that problems, or to perform those tasks. Okay, that was the more like nerdy part of it. So, moving on. At Facebook, the use of our artificial intelligence boils down to creating what we call machine learning classifiers. So, for example, an image recognition classifier can, for example, take an input, a given image, that will run through this model, which is the set of instructions that the model created by being exposed to previous data, and then it will return a set of probabilities telling exactly where that input should fit within a specific class. In that case was an image of a basketball. And you can obviously do the same thing for text recognition classifiers. So here the input, instead of being an image, is actually a text, goes through the model, through those set of instructions that the model created on its own based on data that was fed with, and returns a given classification. So let's dive into the interactive exercise. And here the idea is really to give you a glimpse of what is involved in building a machine learning classifier. And we'll focus on hate speech as people come to Facebook to express themselves, and sometimes those expressions might be offensive. And for us, in order to keep a safe environment for people to express themselves and to build a community, we may need to remove that content that might be deemed inappropriate or hateful. So, and we use AI to help us do this. And it's not only with hate speech. At scale, we are leveraging more and more AI to help, for example, detect fake accounts, to flag for spam, or to flag for terrorist propaganda. So AI systems are being continuously and increasingly leveraged to help us do that content moderation. So here, what we are going to do, what we are going to build, is a hate speech classifier that might leverage not only text, but also images. So think about posts that might have comments, they might have text, but also might have images. So what we want to build at the end of the day is a system that will get an input, will get a specific post, and will have the necessary instructions to decide if that is hate speech, if that should be reported as hate speech or not. So that's the goal of the interactive. So what do we need actually to build a machine learning classifier? So first of all, we need examples, right? We need data. We need examples of content that has been deemed not appropriate and has been deleted from our platform, and also examples of content that should stay on our platform, that should be allowed to be there. So you need both negative and positive examples of hate speech. And that's through that pattern that the machine learning system will learn in future data if that content should be categorized as hate speech or not. So we need examples. The other thing that we need is the abstract rules. So what the machine learning classifier does is, by being exposed to the data, it will formulate its own abstract rules of understanding what that data is about, and will then decide, based on those abstract rules, how content that has never seen before should be categorized. So it's about what I said at the beginning. It's about data, creating instructions, applying it to future data. So let's do this through 2 rounds of interactive. And by interactive, I mean I will ask you to raise your hands to help us actually label pieces of content as hate speech or not hate speech. So we'll go through 2 rounds. The first one that we'll start just immediately, I would just say that don't feel, we will not be handing microphones and asking you why, but you are more than welcome to discuss and to think why that particular decision should actually be deemed hate speech or not hate speech. So on the first round of examples, we will provide you obviously with examples. We will ask you if this is, in your opinion, hate speech or not hate speech, and what kind of abstract rule are we extracting to justify that that this content is actually hate speech or not. So the second round, so we'll do this with 2 examples, and then hopefully we have built a decent machine learning classifier. The second round, we will test that classifier. So we would have the abstract rules, and we will see to what extent they hold water and they can be applicable in covering a new set of examples. Hope that's clear. So maybe just by doing it, it will be even clearer, I hope. So let's start. Sorry, so this round 2. So I'll give you a couple of examples of posts, and I will ask you by show of hands if you think this is hate speech or not. So this one, the first one is just text, no images. And basically it says that's because all the atrocities white people have done on the earth, you white people shouldn't even exist. But you do, and your extinction is coming soon. So my question is, should this piece of content be allowed or should be removed? So by show of hands, who thinks that this is actually hate speech? The panelists can also vote if they want. Okay, thank you. And who thinks this is actually not hate speech? All right. This is very, it's kind of a tie, it's very divided. So for the sake of the exercise, let's assume that this is actually calling for, it's an incitement to violence. It's calling for violence. We're talking about white people as a race not having the right to exist, or even worse, that their extinction is coming, which can be kind of threatening. So the abstract rule, and I will do this in an assisted way. If we had more time, we could actually discuss and come up with different abstract rules. But for the sake of the exercise, let's say that the machine learning would be exposed to this data and several times, thousands, millions of times, and would actually formulate this abstract rule. That would be actually deemed as being hate speech. So inciting violence against any race is hate speech. Okay, I thought actually that this would be pretty straightforward, but there was already a lot of division. So this is not getting easier. Yeah. So yeah, we'll digest that a little bit. Just bear with us. The second example that we have here is a post about a political pamphlet about someone running for office and stating in terms of its arguments for gathering votes that the pledge would be, for example, to stomp out crime or to stop illegal migrants. And I would focus here on the illegal migrants. from flooding into Toronto in this case and draining our resources. So the post is about supporting this political statement, this political view, and has been posted on the platform. So again, with show of hands, would this, in your opinion, be deemed hate speech? Yes. So by show of hands, who thinks this is hate speech? All right. Who does not think this is hate speech? Okay. So here we have a post that is targeting quasi-protected class like migrants. But the fact is that it's not targeting all migrants. It's targeting the ones that are illegal, that by the laws of that country should not actually be entitled to enter the country. And on top of that is a political statement. It's about safety and economy and the views that this person have for the country. So we could think of this actually not being hate speech, and we could, as an abstract rule, we could say that statements about excluding migrants are okay as long as they are illegal migrants. So this could be an example of the abstract rule. Now, we've built our classifier. It's absolutely amazing. So now let's actually test it. So now this is round 2 of the examples, and let's see from the abstract rules that we have formulated to what extent they can actually cover a new set of examples. So here we have a post about a person holding a sign saying ending white supremacy starts with killing all white people. But the post has that image. The post is actually someone asking, why would someone do that? And I would advocate for that. So by show of hands, who thinks that this should be removed from the platform and it is hate speech? All right? Who does not think this is actually hate speech? Okay, so what is interesting now is to see to what extent the abstract rule will hold water. So if we go back to the first example, we formulated that inciting violence against any race is actually hate speech. But here, what is interesting is that in fact, part of the post is inciting violence against race. But most importantly, it is condemning that practice. So the person that is actually posting is challenging and is asking, why would someone do that? So here, we would need to add and expand that rule, saying that, yes, inciting violence is still hate speech, but condemning that very same act should not be seen as hate speech. So we should actually have people on our platform condemning and alerting people to hate speech. So when you build a machine learning classifier, you always have to iterate on those rules, because if you don't, the machine learning classifier probably would just see immediately and jump the gun saying that would be hate speech. So the final example, almost done. And we have here a post about stating that any Muslim refugee caught molesting women or children should be deported immediately with that image. So who thinks that this post should be removed and should be categorized as hate speech? By show of hands. Okay, thank you. Who does not think that this is actually hate speech and it's fine to stay in a platform? Okay, we have the majority going for hate speech here, I think. So let's look at the rule that we had before, right? So we had a statement that excluding migrants are okay as long as they are illegal migrants. But here, actually, we have a couple different things. First of all, we don't have any reference to the fact that they would be illegal or legal. And secondly, we're going beyond the excluding. They're actually talking about deporting migrants. And thirdly, not referring to illegal, they are still referring to a conduct and activity that would be criminal, that would be illegal in nature. So would this rule that the machine learning classifier would have learned would be sufficient to correctly tag this as hate speech or not? So probably not, and probably this would not be seen still as hate speech, but we would need to make some tweaks and expand that rule. So here, we would say that it's not only about excluding. Statements about deporting migrants are okay, as long, not only if they are illegal, but as long as they are conducting any type of illegal activity. So this is to give you just a flavor of the various iterations that goes into machine learning, understanding what rules the machines are actually formulating when being exposed to thousands and millions of examples. I'm running out of time. So just to end with a couple of observations of where humans and AI are actually currently excelling in terms of hate speech detection. And by talking with engineers, what we discovered is that AI is doing a pretty good job at extreme examples. So hard negatives and hard positives, this is beyond doubt, this is hate speech, or this is clearly not hate speech. AI is doing a pretty good job. But then you have all this huge gray area, right, of in the middle. Is this hate speech or not? Is this self-referential? Are we talking about counter speech, which is hate speech, but people condemning it and alerting to it? Is it sarcastic? How context-specific this is? And that area is still difficult for AI systems to reliably flag as hate speech or not hate speech. But the thing is that this gap is narrowing, and for two reasons. First, because we are getting better at finding the right examples. We are finding more and more of those gray examples, but that is not sufficient. We need to be very consistent in the way that we label those examples. So the way that we've done here would not cut it for a machine learning classifier. We cannot have half people saying yes and half people saying no. We need to be consistent to do that. And how do we do that? So there are a number of important safeguards, and I'll go very quickly here. First of all, we would need to have the right data set, but we need to continuously improve and add to that data set those examples. So improving its quality, improving those gray examples that have consistently been labeled so that the machine learning classifier would not be surprised by them and would be doing a better job. But for that, we need people that annotate this type of content being specialized in what they do. And for that, it's extremely important to be exposed to very concrete and detailed guidelines of what hate speech is and what is not. So all these three components allow us to actually build better AI systems, but there's still a long way to go, and hate speech is still traditionally a very difficult area for AI to perform as we would all like it to be. But things are actually improving. And the other thing is that, I want to make sure that you understand that AI is here helping human review, but the human component is actually the most important component of all this pipeline process. So it's all about facilitating human review, but the humans are the ones at the end taking the decision. And for that, we have a huge team of people working on security and safety, and a lot of them specifically on human review that cover various regions of the world, cover work 24/7, and are actually reflecting the diversity of the community in terms of languages, in terms of cultures. So they have that context, the necessary context to evaluate what users directly report as hate speech or what AI might be reporting on its own. And lastly, I think it's also about this human-machine synergies, also important to note that the human are in the loop in various important stages. So when someone posts, you might have either AI or humans reporting it, but when that is reported, it goes to moderators that will actually be the ones making that decision. And even when they do, if they decide either to remove it or to delete it, that decision can still be appealed by the user. So again, you have several instances where humans are deeply involved in actually making the final decision. And finally, what is interesting is that this is the synergy, because all those examples that come from people that are reporting and come from what moderators through guidelines are flagging as hate speech or not hate speech will be fed back into the AI system. And will provide those examples that we so much need to make sure that AI could cover more examples that would be trickier, some as the ones that we've been seeing here. So as more examples we have of people condemning hate speech, the better the AI will be doing it. The more we have examples of targeting a specific class, but actually associating it with illegal status or criminal activity, the more examples we have that, the better the AI will be in learning those nuances and incorporating into its set of instructions. So with that, I finish, and I'll pass the floor to Pierre for the latest on what our research arm of Facebook, the Facebook Artificial Intelligence Research Lab, is doing. Thank you.
Yes. Hello, everyone. So I'd like to give you a taste of what the Facebook AI Research Lab is working on. So our mission is really to advance the state of the art in artificial intelligence. What it means is that we are not working on the Facebook product. We're really working on research, fundamental research in machine learning and artificial intelligence. So how do we do that? We have 160 people covering 7 locations. We believe that research can progress faster and more ethically when it's done in an open way. What it means is that all our works end up being published in journals, conferences. They're publicly accessible. We publish a bunch of open source softwares that people can reuse to either reproduce our results or to tailor a specific algorithm for their needs. We believe that academic research cannot be conducted in an isolated way. We need collaboration, and that's why we have collaboration agreements with academic research organizations, universities basically, in the US, in Canada, in France. We have more than 20 PhD students, and we work very closely with academics on a day-to-day basis. Most of our papers are actually shared with academic labs. We also want our research to be reused, and that's why we work together with startups. We teach classes. As I said, we publish a lot of open source software that will enable people to discover the technology and to actually reuse it for a different purpose. What are these contributions like? A first example would be the DensePose dataset. So on this slide, you can see on the right some images. We've asked humans, we actually hired human annotators to label for each image the position of the head, torso, arms, legs of each person in the image. This gave the dataset that you can see on the right, so the original image and the annotations by the human. And then you can use that to actually train a model that will run on any sequence of images to label where the humans are and how they're moving. Now, what's the point of that? Well, first application would be AR, so augmented reality. You could imagine animate avatars of people that would behave exactly like the person is behaving in real life, but with a different physical aspect. The point of having this open contribution is that it's very expensive to actually hire workers to do that. And so that's why we found it really important that when we did the research on that, we actually published all the data that we had paid for so that anyone else could reuse it and probably come up with a better algorithm for the task. No, this was an example of an AI solving a very narrow task, a very specific task. Whether it is labeling a specific picture or telling you where a specific concept is on a picture, it's always very concise, and it does not apply to a real-world scenario. We are missing a common sense aspect. So I hold this remote in my hand. If I drop it, you all know what is going to happen. It's going to fall down vertically to the floor, and when it hits the floor, it's going to either stay in one piece or shatter into pieces. It's not going to vanish. No, a machine has absolutely no way to do that. We have to actually train it by looking at videos. We have to train it to understand the physical aspects of the videos and to understand what are the rules behind that. And you can see on the picture, on the left, you can see like the frame that is the initial state, and we ask the algorithm to predict what is going to happen. And a naive algorithm would do what is depicted on the bottom and would have a lot of uncertainty about the precise location of the yellow square. And so this yellow square will vanish progressively in the picture, which is absolutely not realistic. And so we're working on these kinds of algorithms that can take this into account and build a better representation of the world and understand really the world that we live in. Another important aspect of building AI is understanding what it does. And very often when you have a machine learning classifier, you actually don't understand exactly why it's making the decision. So on this slide, we actually put the results of a classifier that is taking as an input an image and is telling you what is on the image. So if you show an image with a baseball player, it should tell you baseball. And we've actually gathered examples that are very similar in content, but where the only variation is the race of the person on the picture. And what we see is that most often, the black person will be labeled as a basketball player, and the Asian person will be labeled as a ping pong player. The Caucasian persons will either be baseball players or rugby players. No, this is a problem because these are state-of-the-art algorithms. These are the best of a kind. These are the most precise algorithms that you could devise to tell you what's on the picture. So if you start making decisions based on that, you will get into trouble. No, we are working really into understanding why the models behave like this. We want to understand not only why they behave like this, but how we can train models that are not as biased in terms of race, for instance. And we want to build models that can actually explain why they come up with certain decisions, so that a human can review it and actually tell you whether it makes sense or not. A last application of AI is in a domain where you don't expect it, creativity. So here you see a machine that is trained to generate pictures of images, of clothing. So as it learns, you can see that the generated pictures evolve and they get more and more realistic. In the end, you get the pictures on the right, which are close-ups. They all have a very distinct style and peculiar colors, but they're definitely creative. And that's perhaps one of the more enticing features for AI, is how we could use them to take advantage of this creativity and to actually make us more human in a way that our artists will be enabled by that. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Pierre. I will kind of follow the kind of academic line of your discourse and ask and start the conversation. And I will welcome also the panelists' reactions to some of the things that we've been talking about. But probably I'll start with you, Christophe. Understanding, because the AI conversation is obviously a multi-stakeholder conversation, and academia is very well positioned to advance the technical state of art of AI, but also from a policy governance perspective, there are many uncertainties and many gaps that maybe academia could be positioned to shed some light. What is your take on the role of academia within this ecosystem and of various actors, and how does that play with the work that you've been doing in emphasizing the importance of ethics also as a competitive advantage for companies?
Right, as I said in my speech before, companies ignore ethics at their own risk. I believe business ethics and also here ethics in AI is a kind of risk management device, actually, because companies, especially large companies, face many risks, be it in other fields in terms of corruption, for example, but also here in terms of, well, reputational loss and large reputational loss. And I think it's quite important to see that ethics can, on the one hand, well, definitely be in favor of the ecology of groups, certain minorities, human rights and whatever, but also be something in order to deal with risks for the companies themselves. So that is some work that I've been doing on ethics as a kind of risk management. I think there's a lot of research to be done or already being done here, and this should also be transferred to the field of AI.
Thank you. And Federica, you you give some very interesting considerations, and picking up on the relationship between ethics and law, and what Andrea said about ethics and as a post-compliance element. I was curious to know more about your thoughts on how do you see that space, that room of ethics that goes beyond what law is requiring. What does that translate into for in terms of company practices? And from what you've been tracking, what do you think in that space companies are doing well and are not doing so well?
I think someone recently said ethics comes before, during, and after the law. So it's not an either or. It's sort of like it's something that has to work in parallel. So under the assumption that a company does everything not to lobby against strong laws and fight for strong regulation, which is an assumption, I think there is an important place for ethics. But sometimes the ethical question is on a different level. Sometimes the real ethical question is, should we be doing it in the first place? And this is not my area of work, hate speech, but civil society has been quite vocal on that. It's quite an impossible position for a company to be deciding what is and what isn't hate speech. And there were many voices that said that's maybe not what a company should be put in a place to do in the first place. So I think those are also ethical questions. Ethical questions when it comes to facial recognition can be, should we be doing this in the first place, rather than how can we make sure that our facial recognition is most accurate? And something that I would actually ask you that I'm quite interested in is, the world is really complex and different, and minorities and protected groups differ quite locally, quite a bit. And I'd be very curious to learn how a global company ensures that how we define race differs locally, how we define gender differs locally. In some areas, the discriminated group would be a caste rather than a race, etc., etc. How do you take all these different localizations into account?
I think that's a great question, a question that goes more to the content policy side, which is not my expertise, but I think, and I try to convey that in the message, that the human component, actually the more I work closely with AI engineers, the more I understand how profoundly human AI is in terms of all the flaws and the virtues that we may embed into those automated systems. But coming back to your question, there's obviously a challenge of a company as global as Facebook in offering services and being consistent across the globe, and the challenge of attuning and fine-tuning it to sensitivities and particularities. And I think that's where we've been doing a great effort, is on the human side of things, having more and more content reviewers and more people that actually represent the community that we're serving. So being proficient in the language that they should be reviewing that content, being from the culture. You know, it's not only enough to be speaking Spanish. If actually that content is coming from Mexico, we should have someone from the region, from someone that is actually from that culture. So I think that we are trying to balance that challenge of being global and attuning to specific particularities through the human workforce that we are building on. So on that note, one question that I now have for you, Andre, and you gave us very interesting considerations. It's kind of difficult to choose one, but I'm very curious to understand better what do you mean by the European secret sauce? When we look at all the vast array of ethical frameworks and principles that have been put out there, in what way the work of the high-level group is emphasizing that specific European value of doing AI. Is that already, in your opinion, in the guidelines, or is something that it's in the making? And what does that actually exactly mean?
Now that's a complicated question because the work is still in progress. But I would start with a slogan that I don't agree with necessarily, but it's a slogan that has floated, it's lingered on the work that we've been doing, also coming from inside the European Commission, as a sort of a wishful thinking for the work of the high-level expert group. And the slogan is, AI is the new GDPR, okay? Now, some people would say, oh, great. Some people would say, oh, my goodness. Meaning, some people consider that to be a success. Some people consider that to be something that still has to be verified in terms of what are the actual level of compliance. Is this the right way to regulate a field like this? Is this too rigid? Is this something that is already becoming very quickly obsolete? Is this too burdensome for companies? You know, there are so many different questions. But the underlying spirit is this. With the GDPR, the EU has taken a strong stance on steering developments on the internet, in the internet world, towards compliance with specific principles and potentially giving back to the end users control of their data to the extent possible. The GDPR also carries a spirit of from Europe to the rest of the world, if you wish, the attempt to set standards that all other companies that want to do business with our relatively rich and wealthy and very attractive single market, they will need to comply with specific conditions in order to get there. It's not only this, it's also the reiteration of the fact that legal rules are not crafted in a bottom-up way necessarily at the EU level, and that's a key difference with the approach to lawmaking in the US, which well, it's typically very bottom-up. I do cost-benefit analysis of legislation. When we measure the benefits of a piece of legislation, we normally sum up the willingness to pay of the people in the room, which is something that has been translated in policy much more in the US and the EU. The EU is much more values and principles based, which means you wouldn't be able to decide whether something is hate speech or not necessarily by raising hands. That is another key peculiarity of the EU. And also, what I wanted to add there, if you move in this space of values and principles, you're going to have to start training your machines to not only detect fake, hate speech over time, but also to detect violations of freedom of expression over time, which is in many cases the opposite risk, meaning that in having too many false positives on hate speech, just because maybe you have an obvious liability there because there's a law that tells you might be liable, you forget about curbing freedom of expression, which is an equally important fundamental right. So we fall in there into the gray area. I'm not saying the high-level expert group is really managing to square this circle, but that is the direction. The attempt is to give guidance on how to square this circle and open a dialogue in which companies will show how they plan to square the circle, and someone, be the commission or a future agency, will have to tell companies, well, we think that's a meaningful way of doing that. It will never be perfect, but that's a meaningful way of going about it. Yeah, I'll leave it at there. I have a couple of good examples on this, but maybe if there's time.
An immediate follow-up question, because I really appreciate your comments about the important role of industry within this guidance and how to make it operational. And you mentioned a system where companies would be called to showcase how they would be implementing the principles. Conceptually, it makes a lot of sense. Operationally, how would you see that principle-based compliance system?
And 1 second, before you answer, if anybody has any questions, please queue up at the microphones, and we'll lose the last 10 minutes for the questions. Please go ahead.
All right, it's early days, meaning that I might be anticipating something that has been only being decided behind closed doors, but this is going to be public very, very soon. The European Commission, once this assessment checklist you find at the end of this document will be finalized, we'll want to test this with 1 or 2 use cases. So it will actually invite companies in particular, but also civil society organizations to work with that assessment checklist and tell the Commission if this is something they can work with, if this is something that is too vague, it is something that is not operational enough. And there I think we will have a very interesting dialogue. I've been talking with data scientists who work inside corporations like Facebook for a long time. Sometimes I hear statements that are very understandable from a data science perspective. Statements such as, we fixed fairness. And if you tell a social scientist, like, we fixed fairness, they faint. Because we're never going to fix fairness. But from an operational perspective, in terms of quantitative metrics, fairness metrics, there's a lot of literature in this field. You have been able to operationalize in the process how to make it as likely as possible that the outcomes will be fair. This will be important because at some point someone on the institution's side will have to decide whether this qualifies for due diligence, so it doesn't trigger liability, or liability goes beyond that, that even if you've done everything you could methodologically to avoid unfair outcomes, you would still be liable for that. And this is the way in which I think some of this gray area will be narrowed down over time, not only through corporate practices, but to an interaction between the lawmakers and the corporations and the developers.
Federico, Christoph, you wanted to add some thoughts before we open up? Or
Sure, just because I haven't said that clear enough. I think what companies can do is, one, not lobby against laws. Facial recognition is an example, data protection is an example. Comply with the laws, and not at the bare minimum, but sort of in an ethical way. And then the third thing, something that's very, very important and that only companies can do, is highlighting the limitations and flaws of the technology. Because also regulators, politicians are subjected to that. And the great example was Google pointing out, after the gay faces study, their AI team wrote an article saying this is fake science. And that was much more powerful than anything that anybody else could have said.
Great. And so what we're going to do now is ask people to go ahead and state their question. And we'll get 3 questions, and then we'll turn those over to the panelists all at once. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you. Is this on? Yeah. My name is Charles Rabb. I'm a professor at the University of Edinburgh and also a fellow of the Alan Turing Institute in the UK, where I sit on the data ethics group. I want to add a bit of complexity to it to help me to solve some problems I'm trying to do. In the academic setting, I mean, all we've heard about today, and this is very good, is companies and AI. But here we have universities and AI. And universities, academics both develop AI things and use them within universities, within academic settings, and also partner up with companies and so forth. Now, the question there is, if we simply talk about reputational loss, which might be very important to companies, it can't be the only reason for doing ethical AI for universities, because universities have a different social accouchement, if you like, different public expectations. And therefore, the main reason for doing ethics in AI in universities, it seems to me, is to prevent harm to people or to do good, and so on. And these are part of the principles that the high-level document is talking about. And there may be a tension between reputational loss, risk management, because how far do you go? Once you have reduced the risk, you may still be harming a lot of people. And therefore, there's a tension in how you apply those sorts of principles. And what I'd like to get people's mind around, get my own mind around, is how we can develop principles for doing ethical AI research in an academic setting, because I think that has very large consequences, and particularly for a university like mine, which is a very large and very powerful research university, and likewise the Turing, which is an influential player in the AI field, at least in the UK. So can you help me to think about this in the academic context? Thank you.
Thank you. Next question.
I am Andrea Benoni. I joined the Alliance for Artificial Intelligence. Yesterday, when I have seen the title of the session, I have the doubt, because if we see the difference from European approach and US approach, you wrote research and launch. What is interesting in the proposal guideline is the full product life cycle. So when you design, for what purpose, how you implement, how you maintain, and how you see the result. This is a completely different approach to see just how is working algorithm. And I think this European approach is very interesting, because it's opening more the question how we are managing and for what. This is a completely different approach, and I think this focusing on algorithm is also a little distracting from the reality of what we need. And a little provocation. If you move from just understanding the context to rating, to showing before what is more important for what you think is better for your community, in Italy we had in the past this approach with the newspaper. And there was a totalitarianism. This means that in newspaper, a lot of things was not comparing. If you are rating my messages and bringing up or lower according to your artificial intelligence, this is very dangerous.
Let's get one more question in.
Thank you very much, first of all, for the really interesting talks. My name is Margherita Bernardi. I studied at the Oxford Internet Institute. I researched a little bit on data protection, data privacy. And my question is, the European model on ethics is good, is improving, is what we really want to see as Europeans. The problem is that we are Europeans. There are other countries in the world, there are other realities, and these realities are developing AI, the same technologies that we are developing, maybe even more. And of course, they do not comply to the same kind of ethical principles or rules that we are complying with, which might mean that they are developing technologies even faster, and they're maybe becoming even more, like their products may develop faster because of their ethical rules are, let's say, a bit less strong than ours. So the real question is the unethical model sustainable in the future, or are we just going to have like a big clash, like an even bigger clash that's going to divide us even more on this topic? Thank you very much.
Great. So we have questions then on AI in the academic space specifically, and competition between parts of the world where they have strong ethical guidelines and those that are looser.
Maybe I could say something about ethics in the academic context as well as in the company context. Yes, definitely you are right. We are, in the academic context, we are set to produce guidelines, principles, but the question is who's going to implement them actually? I mean, the academic context is quite important, but it's not the implementation yet. So even if you have a very high-level institute, so you're not implementing it yourself. It will be large companies. So most of the technology is not developed by governments to some extent maybe, but it will be large companies doing it. So I'm not undervaluing that, but I just want to say. And don't underestimate the mechanisms of reputational loss or, for example, legal fines, which is a very substantial mechanism for large companies. We have seen it in Germany with scandals for Siemens or VW. So this is something not to be underestimated, and that's why I'm just saying we should focus both on the justification as well as on the implementation of principles.
Can I have just a very quick reply on that? We are trying to implement them in the university because we have to give ethical approval to researchers within the university.
That's something different. That's not what I was talking about. I
know it's what I'm talking about.
Yeah, but there was a misunderstanding maybe.
Federica or Norberto, what about the question on competition between regions who have
Yes,
different
I want to
values?
comment on this, on the last question. I think the framing as a race is very problematic because the question is not, do we want innovation at any cost? The question is, what kind of innovation do we want? Do we want a society where facial recognition is added to every CCTV camera? I don't think so. It's not really compliant with fundamental values. So I think this race question, I'm very critical that this is actually the case. And the second thing I want to mention, my colleague Scarlett Kim has been doing a lot of work on China, which is probably what you were referring to. It's not like there are no rules in other places. There are not, especially when it comes to government surveillance and human rights, there's huge problems, but it's not like there are no principles. And it's kind of interesting to observe these very carefully, support them, and also not fall into the trope of saying there are no laws in China. There are huge concerns about consumer protection. People also don't want data brokers to sell their data, etc. So there are really interesting developments that I think we should be promoting rather than say they have no laws, they're going to win the race.
And then I think we are, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I would just add and trying to connect to some of the things that you said, Andre. If you look at other models that have been proposed outside the EU, and I will give you the example of Singapore just released its AI governance model, they're actually, from what I understood, aligned with the importance of operationalizing principles and having companies deeply involved. They actually mentioned specifically that principles of companies, their corporate values should be part of that governance framework, and they go beyond saying being operational in terms of understanding probability and severity of harm caused by algorithms. So I think there's also to learn from other systems outside, and I was wondering, we know we're running out of time, maybe we can talk this separately if the group is also taking into account those developments.
Great, and I think that makes us out of time. Thank you so much for Facebook for your presentations to explain better about how you're using AI, and to our panelists who are representing very important government, nonprofit, and academic interests.